Thank you very much to the British Shakespeare Association for bringing us together here at the conference. My talk is titled The Anthropology of Audience in Shakespeare Studies. Shakespeare studies exploded in the late 1980s with interest in his reception during the centuries between then and now. After Jan Kott's Shakespeare Our Contemporary knocked the field off its axis in 1964, reception studies such as Terence Hawkes' That Shakespearean Rag, 1986, The Shakespeare Myth, edited by Graham Holderness in 1988, and Gary Taylor's Reinventing Shakespeare, 1989, grew into concerns with the appropriation of Shakespeare, the title of the 1991 collection edited by Gene Marsden. The field was cemented in 2005 with the creation of a dedicated journal, Borrowers and Lenders, a journal of Shakespeare and appropriation, edited by Christy Desmet and Sujata Iyengar. In 2006, Douglas Lanier dubbed the field Shakespearean Cultural Studies, and in 2014, he theorized the concept of Shakespearean rhizomatics, which opposes the obsession with fidelity in what he calls the arboreal conception of adaptation. So think of Shakespeare as the tall oak tree and his modern manifestations as the branches and leaves, which Lanier opposes to rhizomatic plants. So think of Shakespeare as ground thatch that subterraneanly throws off buds to create new stalks that aren't physically connected to the source, but still remain part of the same system. I'm slightly averse to Shakespearean rhizomatics for a highly non-academic reason. Japanese knotweed. It's classed as one of the worst invasive species in the world. I've been finding it in my backyard for 5 years. So these images are from 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, and when I get back home from the conference, I'll discover if the grass grew this season or if the weeds popped back up. So in my experience, rhizomes are malicious, and the human agency involved is all geared toward containing and eliminating the invasive system. That doesn't sound much like the world of Shakespeare, which expands through deliberate human industry and produces a lot of joy. That's why I'm compelled by Valerie Faisal and Luis Geddes' effort to account for the various forms of modern Shakespearean engagement, reading, watching, enjoying, studying, adapting, appropriating, translating, and so forth, by identifying, quote, a theoretical shift from reader to user currently underway. So building off these works, my talk today theorizes our efforts to understand Shakespeare's presence in modernity. What are we doing when we are unearthing the reception of Shakespeare throughout time and across the globe? Why do we care about the uses and abuses of Shakespeare? I'm going to invoke the discipline of anthropology to theorize what I call the anthropology of audience that has recently arisen in Shakespeare studies. As you probably remember, in the 1980s, New Historicism brought anthropology to bear on Shakespeare's text and context. The anthropology of audience can be thought of as New Historicism aimed at Shakespeare's reception. And to be clear here, I'm not advocating for an approach as much as I'm trying to describe what we've been doing for the past 30 years when we've been obsessed with interpreting the reception of Shakespeare. The simplest way to describe the anthropology of audience is to say that it's the objective study of the subjective experience of art. More specifically, it is the scientific study of the political use of art. Collapsing together one of the tensions in Shakespeare studies at the moment, the anthropology of audience does historicist readings of presentist renderings of Shakespeare. It addresses the origins, motives, commitments, development, organization, networks, and institutions of audience behavior in an effort to create a body of knowledge about interpretive difference, consensus, disagreement, negotiation, and change. As the study of artistic experience as it occurs in the context of cultural engagement, the anthropology of audience marries the philosophy of phenomenology with the social science of cultural materialism for a new kind of Shakespearean reception history and cultural studies. This argument serves as the final chapter of a book titled Shakespeare's Hunch: The Significance of Richard III's Deformities in Literature and Culture. The book tells the story of the physical deformity of Richard III traveling through time into and away from Shakespeare's hands on down to today. So here's old Clifford in 2 Henry VI voicing what I call the figural interpretation of Richard's deformity. Hence, heap of wrath, foul indigested lump, as crooked in thy manners as thy shape. That's deformity as a sign of villainy. And here's Richard in Richard III voicing what I call the causal interpretation. And therefore, since I cannot prove a lover to entertain these fair, well-spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain and hate the idle pleasures of these days. That's deformity as a cause of villainy. The true meaning of Richard's deformity is not positively resolved in the text, leaving it open to interpretation in different time periods which embrace different attitudes towards stigma. Thus, the changing meaning of physical deformity that is repeatedly recontextualized through shifting perspectives and circumstances as time passes in the first tetralogy has prompted and fostered the changing interpretations of Richard, his deformity, his villainy, the relationship between the two, and his status as either the villain or the victim of the Tudor version of history. For example, here's David Hume giving a figural interpretation in 1762, and the dates here are important. This prince was of a small stature, hump-backed, and had a harsh, disagreeable countenance, so that his body was in every particular no less deformed than his mind. But here's Samuel Johnson giving a causal interpretation only 3 years later, in 1765. Richard here speaks the language of nature. Whoever is stigmatized with deformity has a constant source of envy in his mind and would counterbalance by some other superiority these advantages which he feels himself to want. The deformed, like other men, are displeased with inferiority and endeavor to gain ground by good or bad means, as they are virtuous or corrupt. To get some footing on this interpretive debate, I collected all the representations of Richard's deformity over the years that I could find, and I coded them on the basis of 5 questions. First, the question of deformity. According to the writer, was a deformity present? Second, the question of, or the interpretation of deformity, such as figural versus causal. Third, the question of evil. Did the writer see Richard as evil? For the subject, did the writer make a distinction between the historical Richard III and Shakespeare's literary character? And fifth, the discipline. What field or medium was the writer working in? As this chart shows, during the early modern era, before Samuel Johnson in 1765, more than 2/3 of all discussions of Richard III, 51 out of 73 discussions, advanced a figural interpretation. In the sources from this period that I've looked at, there were 53 figural interpretations of Richard's deformity compared to 8 explicitly anti-figural interpretations, only 2 causal interpretations, being Shakespeare's 3 Henry VI and Richard III, and 11 sources that don't mention any deformity. In fact, trimming the time period just a little bit, in the years between 1510 and 1725, figural interpretations comprised more than 80% of all statements about Richard III, 40 out of 48 statements. The chart for the modern era on the right hand of the graph shows how swiftly and decisively the figural paradigm fell from favor in the third quarter of the 18th century, the time after Johnson. We can look at the modern age more closely. This chart sorts the modern age according to discipline. In history writing, almost everyone made the anti-figural argument, but because they were interpreting the historical person rather than Shakespeare's character, they didn't advance a causal argument. In contrast, modern literary criticism, looking at the character rather than the historical person, does advance the causal interpretation. Taken together, anti-figural and causal statements in the modern age outnumbered figural interpretations of Richard's deformity by a margin of 90-9. Shakespeare's hunch shows that in the middle of the 18th century, there was a remarkable paradigm shift in which Shakespeare's causal account of Richard's deformity swung from a suppressed anomaly to the dominant paradigm in the span of only about 10 years, between 1765 and 75. I further argue that when the most common way of understanding Richard's deformity shifted from the figural interpretation that was popular before Shakespeare, which saw Richard's body as a sign of his behavior, to the causal interpretation that Shakespeare had suggested, which saw Richard's deformity as the cause rather than the sign of his villainy, that transition occurred in conjunction with the rise of a whole new way of seeing nature. And the reason I love this photo is that we're here interpreting Dali, interpreting Olivier, interpreting Shakespeare interpreting Richard, and that refraction of interpretation is what the anthropology of audience is all about. Why was there such a radical change in the discourse of Richard's deformity in the third quarter of the 18th century? In a word, modernization. Modernization is often described as the rise of the age of reason and science to replace religion, democracy to replace monarchy, capitalism to replace feudalism, and urbanization to replace country living. But each of those phenomena was a function of the rise of a new mode of understanding why things happen. If we were to extrapolate outward from the example of Richard's deformity, we would say that modernization was not a gradual, incremental change, but a moment in the third quarter of the 18th century when the dominant habits and beliefs related to etiology, the study of causes, and hermeneutics, the theory of interpretation, shifted from figural to causal ways of thinking. Before the modern age, things were understood to be determined according to their relationship to an immaterial world which was thought to be imperceptible but was figured, pointed to, by the things seen before our eyes. In the modern age, material things came to be understood as determined according to their relationship to other material things in a huge interconnected chain of causes and effects. Things previously understood to be signs that figured became, in modernity, things that caused and affected. The greatest statement of literary theory from the Elizabethan age, Philip Sidney's The Defense of Poetry, made 4 points, among many others, that taken together provide the basis for an anthropological approach to literary experience. And the quotes that follow are going to be familiar to many of you, but I've never seen them arranged in quite this way. First, Sidney wrote that poetry, quote, hath the more force in teaching than either history or philosophy. He's thinking here about moral education. History's all particulars, no universals. It only says what has been, not what is or should be. Philosophy's all universals, no particulars. It only deals with ideas and therefore it's boring. In contrast to both, Sidney thought, poetry packages universals in particulars. The poet coupleth the general notion with the particular example. But, and this is a big but, Sidney's second point was that poetry does not make any truth claims. He made this point in response to Stephen Gosson, who, like Plato, feared that poets create a false image of reality that might deceive audiences into false beliefs. Like Aristotle, Sidney denied that poets are dangerous. Poets aren't liars because they do not present themselves as truth-tellers. Quote, for the poet he nothing affirms and therefore never lieth. Sidney's unflinching and unambiguous. Poetry, he thinks, is constitutionally incapable of laying claim to truth, whether, we must infer, it be historical truth concerned with the question, what happened, metaphysical truth responding to the question, what is real, or ethical truth related to the question, what is right. That's a radical idea, but in reiterating and developing this idea, Sidney made a third and even more radical suggestion. He claimed that poetry creates something like a second nature. Quote, the poet lifted up with the vigor of his own invention doth grow in effect into another nature, in making things either better than nature bringeth forth, or quite anew, forms such as never were in nature, as the heroes, demigods, cyclops, chimeras, furies, and such like. Poetry presents things which are patently not real, centaurs, monsters, ghosts, aliens, magic, what have you. But because it does not present them as real, it is not a discourse of deception as Plato and Gosson thought. No one is stupid enough to believe that such things are real just because they appear in a poem. Poetry is not an imitation of nature, but the invention of a second nature, although the second nature of literature has a practical purpose for the first nature of life. We use literature to think and talk about life. It's not a particularly profound or controversial idea. Anyone who's ever identified with the story told in a work of literature and gained insight from thinking or talking about his or her own life in the context of the situation represented in the literary work knows this to be true, but Sidney drew a profound analogy. Milton Naum called it the great analogy between the poet and God, who, having made man in his own likeness, set him beyond and over all the works of that second nature. Collapsing together a number of early modern and modern theological and scientific beliefs, the analogy runs something like this. Just as God created a nature which is inhabited and experienced by humans, who form together into societies, which can be studied through the social science of anthropology, a discourse attending to the form and meaning of the subjective experience of objective reality, the literary author creates a second nature, which is inhabited and experienced by readers, who form together into interpretive communities, which can be studied scientifically through an anthropology of audience, a method of literary criticism attending to the form and meaning of the subjective experience of literature. Just as humans live within and make sense of nature, readers live within and make sense of the second nature of poetry. In synthesizing all of these ideas together, Sidney landed upon his fourth and final point. Poetry offers a good opportunity for readers to develop their ideas about the world. Though he recount things not true, yet because he telleth them not for true, he lieth not. The poet's persons and doings are but pictures, what should be, and not stories, what have been. They will never give the lie to things not affirmatively, but allegorically and figuratively written. And therefore, as in history looking for truth, they go away full fraught with falsehood, so, in poesy, looking but for fiction, they shall use the narration but as an imaginative ground plot of a profitable invention. Poetry doesn't make claims about the world. It creates an imaginative space for thinking about the world. Sidney's analogy to history is a little complicated, but it's also, I think, pretty profound. In history, a person looking for truth may find falsehood, which is an unfortunate transaction. In poetry, a person looking for fiction may find truth, a happy accident. So taking a cue from Sidney's statement that literature is a second nature representing not the world as it is, but the world as it seems or as it ought to be, I want to make note of something which is viscerally obvious to all lovers of literature, but which is also hard-won by literary theorists. Literature offers to both writers and readers a conceptual space in which to consider the problems of culture. Thus, literature's equipment for thinking, not giving the answers to the great hows and whys of life, but helping us pose those questions in the first place. And the interpretations of a text that emerge over time due to shifting contexts of interpretation allow us to study in an anthropological manner what it's like to live within the literary world created by a text, in the space for thought, communication, and debate opened up by the text. And I'm pulling a lot of this material about world building from the Renaissance genre of pastoral and from the modern genres of speculative fiction, sci-fi, and fantasy. In sum, the anthropology of audience is an attempt to study objectively the way we experience literature subjectively, we as individuals, but also we as cultures and communities. And I'm just going to footnote on the screen some of the examples that I find very good. Some of you might see yourselves. I really could have used a number of examples from our conference this weekend here. It's a method of literary criticism which involves speculative explanations of historically specific habits and customs of making sense and making use of literature. In an effort to understand how literature's experience, the anthropology of audience studies the behavior of readers within interpretive communities and the interactions among interpretive communities across space and throughout time. It's a return to the audience-oriented criticism and theory that was the immediate consequence of the death of the author in post-structuralism, but a return which envelops the attention to the social contexts of reading that are emphasized in different ways in both historicism and presentism. The difference between reception history and the anthropology of audience is the same as the difference between history and anthropology as such. Reception history is a collection of particulars from the past, while the anthropology of audience involves a more searching attempt to explain how meaning is ascribed to literature and how interpretations interact with each other. In the anthropology of audience, an analyst who's also a reader tries to make sense of the ongoing interpretive space created by a literary text by becoming immersed in different interpretive communities of the past or present, and then reporting or analyzing his or her observations. The anthropology of audience is scientific as opposed to philosophical, and materialistic as opposed to metaphysical. It's an empirical approach to subjective literary experience. Knowledge is based on observation, both of the text, conceived of here as nature, that is, second nature, and of the readers that live within the interpretive space created by the text, as well as the societies of readers formed within that space. In anthropology, an account of an indigenous society might give us a thick description of the place, the names of the mountains and the valleys, which villages produce corn for tortillas, which produce charcoal, who wears shoes, who doesn't. Likewise, the anthropology of audience involves systematic observation of the second nature of literature, not only thick description of the features of the text that condition and generate meaning, but also an attention to what it's like to experience and make sense of those features. The immersed critic observes how readers interact with texts and how readers interact with each other through discussion, debate, negotiation, friendship, etc. The analyst studies the meanings readers give to texts and the uses readers make of texts, whether or not those meanings and uses are encouraged or supported by the text. There's an interest in collecting massive amounts of data, interpretations, which are the material manifestations of readerly experience. Quantitative data can be collected about a society of readers, enhancing the qualitative analysis more common in the humanities. More likely, there can be an ethnography of sorts, a narrative describing in detail an interpretive community. This is not merely history, a record of particulars. It's a social science providing explanations and generalizations about how things work in certain cultures of reading, the concern of sociology, and across cultures of reading, the concern of anthropology. The anthropology of audience identifies themes and exemplars in the reception of a text. It creates schemes and models and metaphors to describe and explain them. It's inductive, working up from particulars methodically collected to abstractions carefully considered. Hunches form hypotheses. Hypotheses are tested through experimentation. Results should be replicable and verifiable. Laws, describing phenomena repeatedly observed, and theories, explaining repeated phenomena, can be articulated and tested against additional experience. Thus, the anthropology of audience uses the scientific method to study readerly behavior as it occurs within the second nature of a literary text, which allows people from different spaces and times to live and interact with each other as interpretations in the same world. And just as the reason to do anthropology and sociology per se is to better understand one's own lived experience, the reason for doing the anthropology of audience is to better understand one's own experience as a reader, as an inhabitant of the second nature of literature. Thank you.